I had always thought I understood her. My mother, like any other parent, had her quiet moments, the times when she retreated into herself, and I told myself it was just her being tired or lost in thought. But over the years, I began noticing little things. The way she lingered at the window, staring at nothing, how she would sigh deeply after every phone call that seemed insignificant, the way she handled her day-to-day tasks as though each one was heavier than the last. I never questioned it. I had my own life, my own responsibilities, my own endless obligations. I assumed in my youthful arrogance that she was fine, that she had always been fine. After all, she had raised me, fed me, clothed me, sacrificed for me without ever asking for anything in return. Surely she was content in the quiet of her home, with the life she had built for herself. It wasn't until the first time she stopped calling me that the first crack appeared in that illusion. I had been traveling for work, busy with back-to-back meetings and endless emails, thinking about deadlines and presentations, and I didn't notice that it had been 2 weeks since she called. Not that she needed to call every day, I told myself, but something felt off. Normally, she would ring just to say hello, to hear my voice, even if it was only for a few minutes. But the phone remained silent. I pushed it off at first. Maybe she was busy, maybe she had something else on her mind, or maybe I was imagining things. But then another week passed, and another, and still no call. When I finally found the time to stop and think, to listen to that quiet absence, it hit me in a way I hadn't expected. There was no angry tone in my mind, no irritation at her silence. Instead, there was a creeping, gnawing sense of guilt. I began replaying every interaction I'd had with her over the past year. Every time I had dismissed her worries, every time I had been too busy to answer her questions about dinner or errands or the simplest, most mundane parts of her life. I remembered brushing her off when she asked me to help with small household tasks. I remembered the times I had promised to come over and never did, telling myself I would call later, reschedule, make up for it. But I never did. And now, in the quiet, I realized that this absence, the lack of her voice on the other end of the line, was more than just silence. It was her pain, speaking without words. I decided that I had to go to her. Not for a visit, not for a casual catch-up, but for an honest conversation. I had to face whatever it was that had caused this sudden, almost invisible distance. When I arrived, I was struck immediately by how small her house seemed. It wasn't the home I remembered from my childhood, the bustling place filled with laughter and the smell of baked goods, the sound of music playing softly from the radio in the corner. It was quieter now, colder somehow, though the walls were the same. She greeted me at the door with a soft smile, one that didn't reach her eyes, and I could feel the tension before we even spoke. She had been holding something in, carrying it alone, and now that I was here, that weight seemed to hang between us. We sat in the living room, the air thick with unspoken words. I could see her hands tremble slightly as she adjusted her scarf, the veins standing out on the back of her hands. She looked at me, and I saw the history in her eyes, not just the memories of my childhood, but the memories of everything she had endured long before I was born, and all the small sacrifices she had made that I had never acknowledged. I began talking first, stumbling over my words, trying to explain the delay, the work, the distractions, but it felt inadequate. I could feel her disappointment radiating, not as anger, but as something deeper, a sadness that I had never really noticed because I had never really stopped to see her, not fully. And then she spoke. Her voice was quiet, steady, but it carried a weight that made my stomach drop. "I needed you to be here," she said, "even just to listen, even just to care enough to notice." I swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how little I had truly been present in her life, how much I had assumed, and how wrong that assumption had been. We talked for hours that day, though it felt like minutes and centuries all at once. She told me things she had never said before, things she had held inside, wrapped tightly around herself to protect me from worry. She spoke of loneliness, of feeling invisible even when surrounded by family. She spoke of fear, not the kind that is loud and dramatic, but the quiet, lingering fear of being forgotten, of being left behind. And as I listened, I realized that her silence had not been about me at all. It had been about her pain, her way of telling me without words that she was hurting, that she needed recognition, acknowledgement, and most of all, presence. I had mistaken her quiet for contentment when it had been a cry for understanding. I had mistaken her patience for indifference when it had been a shield against disappointment. That afternoon, I began to understand the depth of her experience. The years of holding everything together, the sacrifices she had made, the small betrayals she had endured in silence. And as she spoke, I remembered all the times I had dismissed her feelings, the times I had been too caught up in my own world to notice hers. And the weight of that realization struck me with such intensity that I could barely breathe. Here was the woman who had given me everything, who had carried me through my own storms, who had taught me resilience and love, and I had been blind to her own struggles. I felt a wave of regret, a sharp, almost physical ache that left me shaken. But alongside that regret was a clarity I had never known. I finally understood her pain, and with that understanding came a resolve, a promise to never overlook it again. She paused for a moment, looking at me with eyes that were both stern and tender. "I didn't stop calling because I didn't want to," she said softly. "I stopped because I needed to see if you would notice, if you would care enough to reach out without me prompting you." Her words pierced through me, a mix of accusation and vulnerability that I couldn't ignore. I realized that her silence had been an invitation, a test, a plea for connection. And in that moment, I promised myself that I would answer it, not with excuses, not with half-hearted gestures, but with real presence, real attention, real love. I would be there in ways I hadn't been before, listening not just to her words, but to the spaces between them, the pauses and sighs and quiet hints that spoke volumes. We spent the rest of the evening talking, sharing memories and regrets, laughter and tears. I helped her with small tasks around the house, not because she asked, but because I wanted to, because I finally saw what it meant to be truly present. And as the night drew in, I felt a warmth that had been missing, a connection that went beyond words or obligations. I had finally understood her pain, yes, but more importantly, I had begun to understand her as a whole person, not just as a mother, not just as a figure in my life, but as a woman with her own stories, struggles, and needs. And in that understanding, I found not just empathy, but a sense of closeness that had been absent for far too long. After that day, everything began to feel different. Even the smallest interactions carried weight, a significance I had never noticed before. The quiet morning coffee she made for me wasn't just a habit, it was an act of care, a signal that she had thought of me, even when I wasn't there. The folded laundry on the chair, the neatly arranged kitchen, the notes tucked into books or on the fridge, they weren't mere chores. They were her way of communicating her presence, of reminding me that even when life got hectic, she was still there, still invested in our relationship. And for the first time, I began to see these things not as mundane or ordinary, but as expressions of love and endurance. I started paying closer attention, not out of obligation, but because I genuinely wanted to understand. I realized that my previous ignorance wasn't just laziness or distraction, it was a failure to see her as fully human, to recognize that she had needs, struggles, and vulnerabilities independent of her role as my mother. It was a harsh lesson, one I hadn't expected to learn in such a raw, emotional way, but it was necessary. That silence had forced me to confront my own assumptions, my own indifference, and the consequences of taking her for granted. And in confronting those truths, I began to notice patterns I had overlooked before, the subtle hints of fatigue, the fleeting looks of longing for connection, the restrained sighs that betrayed deeper emotions. It was strange, the way absence could teach presence. I had always thought that being close physically or checking in regularly was enough. I was wrong. I realized that presence isn't measured by frequency alone, but by quality, the ability to listen, to empathize, to engage fully without distraction. When she stopped calling, she wasn't punishing me. She was showing me the gap, the void that existed between us, and giving me a chance to bridge it. And bridge it I did. Slowly at first, with hesitant steps, unsure of how much she would let me in, uncertain if I could truly make up for the months, years, maybe decades of inattentiveness. Our conversations began to change. They weren't just updates about work, errands, or the weather. They became deep dives into emotions, memories, and sometimes painful truths. She shared stories of her youth, the dreams she had put aside, the disappointments she had endured quietly. She told me about friendships that had faltered, about moments when she felt invisible even among loved ones. And as I listened, I understood that her pain wasn't sudden, wasn't born from my neglect alone. It was cumulative, layered over years of sacrifice, expectation, and societal pressures that demanded she put everyone else first. She had carried these burdens silently, like an unacknowledged river beneath the surface, and I had finally come to recognize its existence. One evening, we sat in the living room as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. She held a photo album on her lap, one I had seen countless times before, but never really looked at. Each photograph told a story, a moment frozen in time, but now, with fresh eyes and a more attentive heart, I could see the emotions behind each smile. I noticed the pride in her eyes in pictures of my achievements, the quiet melancholy in others, the moments where she seemed to be holding herself together for my sake. I began asking questions, not out of curiosity alone, but because I wanted to understand her perspective, to see the world as she had experienced it. And slowly, she began to open up more, revealing layers of herself that had been hidden behind the daily routines, the well-practiced smile, the habitual reassurances. It was during these moments that I truly grasped the depth of human emotion, the complexity of love, and the unspoken sacrifices that often go unnoticed. I realized that her silence had been a form of communication I had failed to decode for years. She hadn't stopped calling out of anger or resentment. She had stopped calling to teach me, to show me, in a way I could never have ignored, that presence, attention, and empathy mattered more than any grand gesture. It was a lesson in emotional literacy, a call to understand not just her words but the emotions behind them. And as I learned to listen, really listen, I felt an unfamiliar humility, a recognition of my own shortcomings, and a determination to grow into a more attentive, compassionate human being. But understanding her pain wasn't just about listening or acknowledging it. It was about action, about changing the way I interacted with her, the way I prioritized our relationship. I started visiting more often, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to. I began leaving little notes, sending texts that weren't just perfunctory check-ins, but messages that expressed genuine thoughtfulness. I would ask about her day, her feelings, her thoughts on matters that seemed small but were significant to her. I noticed how she responded differently, not just with words, but with subtle shifts in demeanor. There was a lightness, a warmth, a sense of relief that I hadn't seen before. And with each interaction, I felt a bond growing stronger, a bridge being built over the gaps that had formed over years of neglect and misunderstanding. The transformation wasn't instantaneous, of course. There were moments of awkwardness, of hesitancy, when I would stumble over words or misinterpret her cues. There were times when I felt frustrated with my own limitations, my inability to fully grasp her experiences, and moments when I wondered if I could ever truly make amends. But each misstep became a lesson, each conversation a step closer to understanding, each shared silence a space for empathy to grow. Slowly, steadily, I began to recognize the beauty in the ordinary, the significance in small gestures, and the profound power of simply being present. It was during one of these quiet evenings that I realized just how much her silence had taught me. I wasn't merely responding to her needs. I was learning a fundamental truth about human connection, that love is not only expressed in grand acts or spoken declarations but in attentive presence, in noticing what is unsaid, in understanding the emotional rhythms of those we care about. I began applying this lesson not just to her, but to others in my life. I noticed friends who felt overlooked, colleagues who seemed burdened by invisible struggles, and I realized that the same principle applied universally. Empathy requires effort, attention, and a willingness to go beyond the surface. By the time I left her home that night, I felt different. I was not just her son, I was someone who had been awakened to the subtle, complex truths of emotional care. Her pain had been a teacher, harsh and unyielding, but also profoundly illuminating. And though the journey was just beginning, I felt a sense of hope, a sense that even small, consistent acts of presence could mend old wounds and deepen connections. That silence, once so confusing and painful, had become a guidepost, showing me the way to a more compassionate, attentive, and loving approach to relationships. The days that followed felt like stepping into a new world, one I had never fully appreciated before. Every interaction carried weight, and I started noticing the small, subtle things she did for me and for herself. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about seeing her as an individual, someone with her own complexities, her own unspoken struggles, and her own silent victories. I realized that love is not a one-way street, and that to truly connect with someone, I needed to understand not just what they do for me, but what they endure and carry internally. I began to recognize the strength in her silence, the resilience in the way she faced the world, and the quiet determination that had kept her going through hardships I could scarcely imagine. I remembered a time when I had called her after a particularly hard day at work, expecting the usual comforting words and cheerful tone, only to hear a trace of weariness in her voice. I had brushed it aside, assuming she was tired or busy. But now I understood. That subtle shift in her tone was a reflection of her own challenges, her own fatigue from balancing so many responsibilities. It wasn't a lack of love, it was life's weight pressing down on her. And suddenly, I felt a surge of empathy that I had never experienced before, an awareness that our experiences are intertwined, but each person carries their own burdens. That realization transformed how I approached our relationship, shifting my mindset from one of expectation to one of understanding and mutual care. Conversations began to deepen in ways I had never anticipated. We discussed our dreams and regrets, the lessons life had taught us, and the moments we wished we could revisit or change. I learned about her aspirations beyond her role as a mother, the hobbies she had once loved, the passions she had put aside. She spoke of friendships she had nurtured and lost, of choices she had made under pressure, and of times she had felt unseen. And as I listened, I felt a profound sense of respect and admiration for her journey. I realized that my perception of her had been limited, shaped by routine and familiarity, and that by opening myself to truly see her, I was discovering a depth of character that was inspiring and humbling. One afternoon, I noticed her sitting quietly by the window, a book in her lap, but her eyes distant. I asked if she was all right, and she hesitated before speaking. She told me about the loneliness that sometimes accompanied her days, a feeling I had never acknowledged, let alone understood. I realized that her silence, her absence of calls, had been a gentle nudge to pay attention, to see the subtle cues I had ignored for years. That moment was a turning point. I understood that connection requires active engagement, noticing the unspoken signals and responding with care. It wasn't enough to show up physically. I had to be present emotionally, attuned to the rhythms of her heart and mind. I started small, with gestures that felt natural yet meaningful. I left her favorite tea by her chair in the morning, sent a text to check in without expecting a response, and occasionally cooked a meal to ease her daily load. Each action was met with a subtle, almost imperceptible change in her demeanor, a softening of her expression, a lightness in her voice, a warmth that lingered longer than the moment itself. These small acts became the foundation of a renewed relationship, one built on awareness, appreciation, and empathy. I began to see that it wasn't the grand gestures that mattered most, but the consistency of attention, the recognition of effort, and the genuine desire to understand and support. Her stories began to flow more freely, sometimes accompanied by laughter, sometimes tinged with melancholy. She recounted moments of triumph and moments of doubt, sharing insights I had never considered. I realized that understanding her pain was not about offering solutions, but about creating space for her to express herself fully, without judgment or interruption. That space became a sacred place where trust could grow, where I could witness her humanity, and where I could practice empathy in its truest form. Each story was a piece of the puzzle, revealing the depth of her experiences and the resilience that had sustained her through the challenges of life. There were moments of tension, of course. Old patterns of miscommunication would surface, and I would occasionally misinterpret her words or intentions. But even these moments became opportunities for growth, prompting reflection and discussion. I learned to approach misunderstandings with patience, to listen before responding, and to acknowledge the emotions behind her words rather than focusing solely on content. This shift in perspective transformed not only our relationship but also my understanding of interpersonal dynamics. I realized that empathy requires effort, attention, and humility, and that true connection is forged not in perfection but in the willingness to engage sincerely, even when it's difficult. As weeks turned into months, our bond strengthened. I noticed a change in myself as well. I was more patient, more attuned to the needs of others, and more appreciative of the small moments that often go unnoticed. I began applying these lessons beyond our relationship, reaching out to friends and colleagues with greater attentiveness, noticing struggles that previously would have gone unseen. I felt a sense of fulfillment that I had never experienced, a recognition that the act of truly seeing and understanding another human being is profoundly transformative. One evening, she handed me a handwritten note, simple yet powerful. It expressed gratitude for my renewed attention and presence, acknowledging the effort I had put into understanding her world. I felt a wave of emotion, realizing that our journey together had evolved from one of routine interactions to a profound mutual understanding. That note symbolized more than words on paper. It represented connection, recognition, and the depth of care that comes from truly seeing someone. It was a testament to the transformative power of empathy and the enduring significance of presence. Through this process, I came to a vital realization. Understanding someone's pain is not about sympathy or pity. It's about awareness, acknowledgement, and active engagement. It's about creating space for others to express themselves, responding with attentiveness, and being willing to learn from experiences that may be uncomfortable or challenging. My mother's silence had been a teacher, guiding me toward a deeper understanding of emotional intelligence, compassion, and the intricate dynamics of human relationships. By embracing this lesson, I felt a profound shift not only in my relationship with her, but in my approach to life itself. I became more reflective, more empathetic, and more willing to engage deeply with the people around me. The transformation was gradual, subtle, and continuous, but it was undeniable. I had learned that love is not passive. It requires effort, attention, and the courage to confront one's own shortcomings while striving to connect authentically. Life has a way of teaching its lessons subtly, often through the very experiences we wish we could avoid. For me, understanding her pain was not a single moment of revelation. It was a series of small awakenings, each one revealing a layer of her life I had previously overlooked. I started noticing the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she would pause before responding to messages, the slight hesitation in her laughter when she thought no one was paying attention. These were not signs of disinterest, as I had once believed, but reflections of the weight she carried silently. And as I observed more closely, I realized how much effort it took for her to maintain composure, to meet the expectations of others, and to navigate a world that often demanded more than it gave. I remember one particular evening sitting across from her at the dinner table when she quietly shared a memory from her childhood. She spoke of a time when she had felt unseen, unheard, and unimportant, a pattern that had lingered into adulthood in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Her voice was soft, almost tentative, yet there was a strength in her vulnerability that I had never truly appreciated before. As I listened, I felt a deep surge of empathy, a realization that her struggles were not about me or our relationship alone. They were shaped by years of experiences, expectations, and emotions that I had no right to judge. This understanding became a cornerstone in the way I approached her, shifting my mindset from one of expectation to one of genuine concern and attentiveness. Our conversations began to take on a new rhythm, one that prioritized listening over speaking, understanding over judgment. I noticed that she began to open up more, sharing her thoughts and feelings without fear of interruption or dismissal. She spoke about her dreams, her disappointments, and the moments she had quietly celebrated alone. I began to understand that her silence had not been a rejection, but a call for space, a subtle plea for patience and understanding. And in responding to that call, I discovered a depth of connection that I had never experienced before, a bond built not on convenience or habit, but on empathy, respect, and mutual recognition. One afternoon, I observed her tending to her garden, her hands carefully nurturing the plants she loved. I asked her why she found such joy in this seemingly mundane task, and she paused before answering. "It's the one place where I can control what grows," she said quietly, "and where I can see the results of my care and attention." That simple statement revealed so much about her life, her desire to nurture, to create, and to see the impact of her efforts. It also mirrored her own experiences. She had spent so much time caring for others, often without acknowledgement, yet here was a place where her efforts bore visible fruit. Witnessing this, I felt a profound respect for her resilience and her capacity to find meaning even in small, overlooked acts. I began to apply this awareness to all aspects of our relationship. I noticed the small sacrifices she made, the moments she chose to prioritize others over herself, and the quiet ways she managed her responsibilities. Each observation added to my understanding of her pain and her strength. I realized that truly knowing someone requires attention to the subtle details, the quiet gestures, and the unspoken emotions that shape their daily life. It's about seeing beyond surface behaviors and recognizing the intricate web of experiences that influence actions, decisions, and reactions. Her moments of silence became less intimidating and more enlightening. I learned to approach them with curiosity rather than frustration, to see them as opportunities to reflect and to connect rather than as barriers to communication. I discovered that empathy is not about filling the silence with words, but about being present within it, acknowledging it, and allowing the other person to navigate it at their own pace. This understanding transformed our interactions, creating a space where both of us felt safe to express ourselves honestly and without fear of judgment. There were times when I struggled to maintain patience, when old habits of expectation crept back into my thoughts. I would wonder why she hadn't called, why she hadn't responded, or why she seemed distant, but each time I reminded myself of the lessons I had learned, that her silence was not a reflection of her feelings for me, but a reflection of her own journey, her own challenges, and her need for space. By reframing my perspective, I was able to approach these moments with understanding rather than frustration, cultivating a deeper sense of empathy and connection. I also began to see the impact of her experiences on the way she approached relationships, both past and present. She spoke of friendships that had ended abruptly, of family dynamics that had been complicated and painful, and of expectations that society had placed upon her. Each story revealed resilience, adaptability, and the courage to navigate situations that were often emotionally taxing. I realized that her pain was intertwined with strength, that her challenges had shaped her into someone remarkable, and that truly understanding her required acknowledging both the hardships and the victories she had experienced. As our bond strengthened, I noticed changes within myself as well. I became more attentive to the needs of those around me, more willing to listen deeply, and more conscious of the impact of my actions and words. I recognized that understanding someone's pain is not a passive act. It requires effort, observation, and a commitment to growth. By embracing this mindset, I cultivated not only a stronger relationship with her, but also a deeper sense of compassion for others in my life. One evening, as we sat quietly watching the sunset, she leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered a simple statement, "Thank you for seeing me." Those words resonated deeply within me. They were not about grand gestures or dramatic moments. They were about acknowledgement, understanding, and the power of genuine presence. I realized that all the effort, patience, and attentiveness had culminated in this simple yet profound recognition. It was a reminder that connection is not measured by frequency of communication or visible gestures alone, but by the depth of understanding and the sincerity of care. Through this journey, I came to appreciate the complexity of human emotion and the importance of intentional empathy. I understood that relationships thrive not when we demand constant attention, but when we cultivate awareness, patience, and a willingness to truly see the other person. Her absence of calls had been a catalyst, a wake-up call to engage more fully, to listen more attentively, and to respond with care and authenticity. In embracing this lesson, I not only strengthened our bond, but also grew as an individual, learning the value of presence, attentiveness, and emotional intelligence. The days that followed were quieter, yet more meaningful. I started noticing the nuances of her behavior that I had once dismissed or misinterpreted. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear before speaking, the subtle hesitation before she shared her thoughts, even the careful way she chose her words. All of these details painted a picture of someone who had learned to protect herself, to safeguard her emotions, and to navigate the world with a cautious yet resilient heart. I realized that her pauses were not emptiness, but depth. Her silences were not indifference, but reflection. Understanding this reframed my approach entirely. I no longer sought constant validation or attention. Instead, I became attuned to the quiet rhythms of her life, learning to appreciate the moments she chose to share as gifts rather than expectations. It was during one of these quiet moments that I finally understood the gravity of her pain. We were walking along a narrow street lined with old brick buildings, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. She paused suddenly, staring at a cracked wall as if it held a memory only she could see. I asked her what she was thinking, and she hesitated before speaking. "Sometimes the walls we build around ourselves," she said softly, "are not to keep people out, but to keep ourselves from falling apart." Those words struck me profoundly. In that moment, I realized that her silence, her distance, and her hesitations were not flaws. They were protective measures honed over years of experience, layers of armor she had crafted to survive, endure, and still find a way to care despite the weight she carried. From that day on, I approached our interactions with a heightened sense of awareness. I stopped expecting immediate responses, understanding that her mind and heart often needed space to process emotions before she could articulate them. I learned to celebrate the small gestures, a quick text, a subtle smile, or a brief conversation, recognizing that these were her ways of expressing connection without compromising her emotional well-being. Each interaction became an opportunity to deepen my empathy, to honor her boundaries, and to cultivate a bond built on respect rather than convenience. I also began reflecting on my own behavior. I realized how often I had taken communication for granted, assuming that silence was always a negative indicator rather than a natural part of her process. I had to confront my impatience, my need for reassurance, and my tendency to misinterpret quiet as rejection. This self-awareness was humbling but necessary. It forced me to examine the ways in which I had imposed my expectations on her, rather than adapting to her unique needs. By acknowledging my own shortcomings, I was able to approach her with a renewed sense of humility, patience, and understanding, a crucial step in bridging the gap that had once existed between us. Her vulnerability began to surface more naturally over time. She shared stories from her past, memories that had shaped her, experiences that had left scars, and moments that had fueled her resilience. Listening to her, I realized that her pain was multifaceted, encompassing not only personal struggles, but also societal pressures, familial expectations, and the quiet burden of responsibility she often carried alone. Each revelation deepened my respect for her strength, and I became increasingly aware of the importance of validating her experiences rather than offering solutions or judgments. My role was not to fix her pain, but to witness it, understand it, and stand beside her as she navigated it. One evening, we sat on the balcony of her apartment, the city lights twinkling below us. The air was crisp, carrying a hint of winter, and she leaned back in her chair, eyes closed, taking a slow, deliberate breath. I asked her what she was feeling in that moment. After a pause, she whispered, peace, mostly, but also the weight of knowing I have to keep moving forward, even when it's hard. That statement encapsulated so much about her life, the balance between struggle and resilience, the tension between vulnerability and strength, and the quiet courage required to live authentically in a world that often misunderstands or undervalues emotional depth. Witnessing this, I felt a profound sense of awe, a recognition that her pain was not a weakness, but a testament to her endurance, intelligence, and capacity for love. Understanding her pain also transformed the way I approached conflict and disagreement. Previously, I had viewed moments of tension as obstacles, times when communication broke down or when emotional distance created friction. But now I saw these moments as opportunities for empathy, reflection, and growth. I learned to pause, listen, and seek to understand the underlying causes of her emotions, rather than reacting defensively or imposing my perspective. This shift in approach not only reduced unnecessary friction, but also fostered deeper intimacy, trust, and mutual respect. Conflict became a bridge rather than a barrier, a space where we could explore vulnerabilities, clarify misunderstandings, and strengthen our connection. Began noticing patterns in her coping mechanisms, the strategies she had developed to navigate stress, uncertainty, and emotional turbulence. She often withdrew temporarily, not as a sign of disinterest, but as a means of regaining composure, organizing her thoughts, and approaching situations with clarity. She journaled frequently, using writing as a tool to process complex emotions and to articulate experiences that were difficult to share verbally. She also found solace in creative pursuits, painting, music, and quiet walks, activities that allowed her to reconnect with herself and recharge her emotional reserves. Observing these patterns, I realized that her silence was a form of self-care, a vital component of her ability to maintain balance and resilience in a demanding world. Her journey taught me the importance of emotional literacy, the ability to recognize, interpret, and respond thoughtfully to emotions, both one's own and those of others. I had assumed that empathy was a passive skill, something inherent or intuitive, but I discovered that it requires conscious effort, reflection, and practice. By engaging fully with her experiences, I honed my own capacity for empathy, developing a deeper appreciation for nuance, context, and the complex interplay of factors that shape human behavior. This awareness extended beyond our relationship, influencing the way I interacted with friends, family, and colleagues, fostering a more compassionate and patient approach to all interpersonal dynamics. There were moments when her pain felt overwhelming, moments when I struggled to reconcile her vulnerabilities with my own desires for closeness and reassurance. During these times, I reminded myself that connection is not about erasing pain or eliminating distance, but about navigating it together with patience, understanding, and mutual respect. I learned to embrace uncertainty, to tolerate ambiguity, and to honor her process rather than rushing it. This mindset transformed not only our interactions but also my personal growth, teaching me resilience, humility, and the profound value of patience in cultivating meaningful relationships. Through these experiences, I came to understand that her silence and distance were not signs of rejection, but invitations to see her fully, to engage with her thoughtfully, and to appreciate the depth of her inner world. Each missed call, each pause, and each quiet moment became an opportunity to practice empathy, to deepen my understanding, and to strengthen the bond we shared. By shifting my perspective from one of expectation to one of presence, I discovered a level of connection that transcended superficial communication, revealing the transformative power of patience, attentiveness, and genuine care. With time, I began to notice the subtle ways in which her pain shaped not only her actions, but also her worldview. She approached life cautiously, yet with a quiet determination that was profoundly inspiring. She did not rush into decisions or commitments, not because she doubted herself, but because she had learned that thoughtfulness often outweighed impulse. Her patience was not passive. It was a deliberate practice born from years of observing the consequences of hasty choices. Watching her navigate daily life with this quiet precision taught me the value of mindfulness, of being fully present, and of recognizing the long-term effects of even small actions. I began to understand that her boundaries were sacred to her. The moments she chose to share were rare and precious, not to be taken lightly. I realized that my role was not to push her to open up, but to create an environment in which she felt safe enough to do so naturally. This involved cultivating trust, demonstrating consistency, and showing that my care was unwavering even when our communication ebbed and flowed. The trust we built was not immediate. It was gradual, a delicate process of showing reliability, respect, and empathy day after day. Each gesture, each thoughtful word, each patient response added a layer of security, allowing her to slowly dismantle the walls she had carefully constructed over time. I also learned to celebrate her resilience. Even in moments of difficulty, she carried herself with a quiet grace that reflected both strength and vulnerability. There were days when her pain was palpable, moments when her eyes carried unspoken burdens, and yet she moved forward, often without complaint. Witnessing this resilience changed my perception of what it means to be strong. Strength, I realized, is not the absence of pain, but the ability to continue despite it. Her courage was a lesson not just in endurance, but in authenticity, the courage to feel deeply, to process fully, and to engage with the world without losing oneself in the process. Our conversations evolved over time. What had once been superficial exchanges became profound dialogues about life, emotions, and personal growth. We spoke about our childhoods, the influences that shaped us, our dreams, fears, and regrets. She spoke with honesty, and I listened with an openness that mirrored her own vulnerability. This dialogue revealed patterns, coping mechanisms, and the intricate ways in which her experiences influenced her responses. Each conversation was a window into her soul, an opportunity to understand not only her pain, but also the beauty and complexity of her perspective. Through these interactions, I came to appreciate the depth of human emotion, the layers of history that inform behavior, and the subtle ways in which empathy can transform relationships. I began to reflect on the times I had failed to understand her in the past. I remembered moments when I misread her silence as disinterest or frustration, when I interpreted her boundaries as rejection. Recognizing these mistakes was uncomfortable but necessary. It forced me to confront my own insecurities, assumptions, and the ways in which I projected my needs onto her. By acknowledging these missteps, I was able to approach our interactions with renewed humility and mindfulness. I learned that understanding another person is a continuous process, one that requires self-awareness, patience, and a willingness to adapt without judgment. Her influence extended beyond our relationship. Observing her resilience, empathy, and thoughtful approach to life inspired me to reevaluate my own habits and mindset. I became more reflective, more attuned to the needs of others, and more conscious of the impact of my words and actions. The lessons she imparted, often without explicitly teaching, became embedded in my daily life. I noticed a shift in my relationships with family, friends, and colleagues. I was more patient, more empathetic, and more willing to listen deeply before responding. Her approach to life, shaped by pain and resilience, became a model I aspired to emulate in my own way. One day, during a particularly reflective walk, she shared something that encapsulated her philosophy. Pain isn't something to erase or avoid, it's something to understand, to navigate, and to allow to teach you. Those words resonated deeply. I realized that her silence, her caution, and her distance were not indicators of weakness, but manifestations of wisdom and survival. She had learned to integrate pain into her life in a way that was constructive, allowing it to inform her choices without dominating her spirit. This perspective challenged my previous notions of communication and connection, emphasizing the importance of patience, observation, and non-judgmental support. We encountered moments of tension, as all relationships do. There were misunderstandings, moments of frustration, and instances when our emotional needs did not perfectly align. But the difference now was profound. Instead of reacting impulsively, I approached these situations with a mindset of inquiry and empathy. I sought to understand the underlying reasons for her responses rather than judging them superficially. This approach transformed conflicts into opportunities for growth, allowing us to navigate differences with respect and consideration rather than defensiveness. Each challenge became a chance to deepen trust, strengthen communication, and demonstrate that care is most meaningful when it persists through difficulty rather than only during ease. Her pain also illuminated the importance of self-compassion. Watching her tend to herself, manage her emotions, and honor her boundaries taught me that supporting someone does not mean erasing their struggle. True support involves recognizing and validating their experiences while maintaining respect for their autonomy. I learned that attempts to fix her pain would have been counterproductive. Instead, the most meaningful contribution I could make was to be present, to listen actively, and to demonstrate patience and understanding. This realization reshaped my approach to relationships entirely, emphasizing the value of empathy, active listening, and unconditional support. I began to notice the small, almost imperceptible ways in which our connection deepened. A fleeting smile, a brief touch, a shared glance. These moments became symbols of trust and intimacy. They demonstrated that understanding does not always require words. Sometimes it is conveyed through presence, attention, and attunement. I realized that my previous impatience had obscured these subtle cues. Now, by slowing down and observing carefully, I was able to experience the richness of her communication in its full complexity. The depth of our bond grew not from constant interaction, but from the meaningfulness of each shared moment, each thoughtful gesture, and each patient response. I also learned to appreciate her independence. Her strength and resilience were complemented by a desire for autonomy, a need to navigate parts of her life alone. Initially, I struggled with this, interpreting her independence as distance. Over time, I came to understand that her autonomy was a testament to her self-awareness, maturity, and ability to balance connection with self-care. Rather than seeing it as a threat, I embraced it as a vital component of a healthy, sustainable relationship. Her independence became a lesson in trust, reminding me that true intimacy does not require constant proximity, but a balance of closeness and personal space. As our connection continued to evolve, I noticed how her past experiences subtly influenced her perception of trust and vulnerability. She did not wear her heart on her sleeve, not because she lacked emotions, but because she had learned through experience that trust must be earned and vulnerability must be met with care. I realized that my impatience in the past had caused me to overlook this truth. Understanding her required patience, attentiveness, and an appreciation for the pace at which she was willing to reveal herself. It was not about rushing intimacy, but about creating a consistent environment where her openness could flourish naturally. Her stories of the past were often shared with a mixture of caution and courage. She spoke of heartbreaks, disappointments, and moments of despair, yet always framed them with reflections on what she had learned. Each narrative was a lesson in resilience, a testament to her ability to navigate adversity without losing herself. Listening to her, I recognized the complexity of human experience, the intertwined threads of joy, pain, growth, and vulnerability. It became clear that her silences were as informative as her words, teaching me to read between the lines, to understand the emotions beneath the surface, and to respond with empathy rather than assumption. I also observed how she navigated her emotions with remarkable mindfulness. She allowed herself to feel deeply, to process experiences fully, and to integrate lessons without becoming overwhelmed. There were times when sadness or frustration would surface, yet she did not shy away from them. Instead, she acknowledged them, reflected on their origins, and allowed them to inform her choices. This approach contrasted sharply with my own tendencies to react impulsively or to suppress difficult emotions. Watching her, I began to appreciate the value of emotional intelligence, the importance of self-reflection, and the power of acknowledging feelings rather than fearing them. Our interactions taught me the subtle art of communication. I realized that understanding someone like her required attentiveness to tone, body language, and timing. Words alone were not sufficient. The pauses, the inflections, and the unspoken gestures conveyed volumes. I became more observant, more patient, and more willing to listen without interruption. Over time, this attentiveness deepened our connection, allowing us to navigate misunderstandings before they escalated. I learned that listening is not merely hearing, but fully engaging with the emotional subtext of what is expressed and responding in a way that validates the speaker's experience. I began to notice the moments when her walls were most evident, times when she withdrew slightly, when her responses were measured, when she seemed lost in thought. Initially, I had mistaken these moments for disinterest or annoyance, but now I understood them as periods of processing, self-reflection, and recalibration. Her silences were not rejections, they were opportunities for her to gather strength, to reassess, and to prepare for authentic engagement. This realization shifted my perspective entirely. I no longer felt the need to fill every silence with words or reassurance. Instead, I learned to honor the space she needed, recognizing that patience and respect were forms of care just as powerful as verbal expressions of affection. There were also moments of shared joy that revealed the depth of her spirit. Her laughter, subtle and unassuming, carried a warmth that was both infectious and grounding. She found delight in small, often overlooked aspects of life, a carefully brewed cup of tea, a quiet evening walk, or a meaningful conversation with a friend. Observing her appreciation for these moments reminded me of the importance of presence, gratitude, and attentiveness to the beauty in everyday life. It was a lesson in savoring the present, in noticing the subtle joys that often pass unnoticed when life is rushed. As our bond deepened, I began to understand her approach to relationships more fully. She valued authenticity above all else. She did not seek superficial connections or forced intimacy. Instead, she invested deeply in relationships that were genuine, reciprocal, and grounded in mutual respect. This approach challenged me to reconsider my own tendencies. I realized that I had sometimes prioritized convenience or immediacy over depth and authenticity. Her example encouraged me to slow down, to invest emotionally in a meaningful way, and to approach relationships with intention rather than impulse. Her pain, once a source of frustration for me, became a lens through which I could better understand the human experience. I recognized that emotional struggles are not barriers to connection, but invitations for empathy, understanding, and growth. Witnessing her navigate her emotions, set boundaries, and seek balance inspired me to approach my own challenges with similar mindfulness. Her resilience was a reminder that strength is not measured by the absence of pain, but by the ability to engage with it thoughtfully, to learn from it, and to allow it to inform rather than define one's path. There were times when I saw her internal conflicts play out subtly in her expressions or choices. She would wrestle with decisions, balancing her own needs with the expectations of others. Her careful deliberation reflected a deep sense of responsibility, both to herself and to those she cared about. I learned that supporting her did not mean removing these challenges, but being present as she worked through them. It meant offering guidance when requested, validating her perspective, and providing reassurance without judgment. This approach strengthened our bond, creating a foundation of trust and mutual respect that allowed both of us to grow individually and together. Our conversations often drifted into reflections on life's impermanence, the fleeting nature of moments, and the importance of intentional living. She spoke of experiences with gratitude, acknowledging pain alongside joy, and finding meaning in the journey rather than the destination. Listening to her, I was reminded that life is a tapestry woven from both struggles and triumphs, and that understanding this balance is key to emotional maturity. Her insights encouraged me to embrace life more fully, to honor my own experiences, and to approach relationships with greater compassion and patience. Through these experiences, I also came to appreciate the transformative power of empathy. By striving to understand her perspective, I became more attuned to the emotions and needs of others around me. I noticed changes in my interactions with friends, family, and colleagues. I became more patient, more compassionate, and more willing to listen deeply. Her influence extended beyond our relationship, shaping the way I approached human connection in all areas of life. Empathy, I realized, is not merely a passive feeling, but an active practice that strengthens bonds and fosters meaningful connections. Her approach to life was marked by a quiet strength that left a lasting impression. She faced challenges without complaint, sought understanding without judgment, and approached relationships with authenticity and integrity. Observing her, I understood that her actions were guided not by fear or defensiveness, but by a deliberate and thoughtful engagement with the world. Her example taught me that resilience is cultivated through reflection, self-awareness, and mindful decision-making. By embracing this mindset, I was able to navigate my own challenges with greater clarity, patience, and courage. As time went on, I noticed subtle changes in myself that I hadn't anticipated. I became more patient, more observant, and more considerate, not just with her, but with everyone around me. Her way of navigating the world, with care and attentiveness, had influenced my own approach to relationships and life in general. I realized that understanding her pain and learning to respond to it with empathy rather than frustration had transformed me. Where I once rushed to conclusions or acted impulsively, I now paused, listened, and reflected. This shift in mindset wasn't instantaneous, it was gradual, nurtured by countless small interactions, shared silences, and the unspoken lessons she imparted through her demeanor and actions. I began to see that her withdrawal was never about me personally. It was about her need to process, reflect, and protect her emotional space. Early on, I had misinterpreted her moments of silence as disinterest or rejection. But now I understood them as necessary intervals for her to recharge, reassess, and return with clarity and openness. These periods, though initially confusing, became essential parts of our rhythm. I learned to respect them, recognizing that love and connection are not about constant communication, but about the quality of presence and understanding during the moments we do share. Her approach to conflict also taught me invaluable lessons. When disagreements arose, she didn't resort to anger, blame, or defensiveness. Instead, she articulated her feelings calmly, explained her perspective thoughtfully, and invited dialogue rather than confrontation. This method challenged me to rethink my own reactions. I had previously allowed frustration or impatience to guide my responses, but her example encouraged me to embrace patience, seek understanding, and approach conflicts with compassion. Over time, this created a foundation of trust and safety that allowed both of us to express ourselves honestly, without fear of judgment or dismissal. I also began to notice the little ways she expressed care and attention even when she wasn't speaking. A gentle gesture, a subtle smile, or a thoughtful action often conveyed more than words could. These quiet expressions of affection carried profound meaning, teaching me that intimacy is not only verbal but also rooted in attentiveness and presence. I started paying closer attention to the nonverbal language of those around me, realizing that much of human connection is conveyed through subtle cues rather than overt statements. Her behavior became a mirror, reflecting the depth of attention and empathy that underlies meaningful relationships. One of the most important lessons I learned from her was the value of boundaries. She set them clearly and consistently, not as a form of rejection, but as a means of preserving her emotional health and maintaining balance in her life. Initially, I struggled with this concept, interpreting boundaries as obstacles or limitations. However, I gradually realized that respecting her boundaries was a demonstration of care, patience, and understanding. By honoring them, I not only strengthened our relationship but also gained a deeper appreciation for the importance of self-respect and the balance between intimacy and autonomy. Her pain, when she shared it, was never melodramatic or self-indulgent. Instead, it was quiet, dignified, and deeply human. She spoke of disappointment, loss, and the moments that had shaped her life with honesty and courage. Listening to her, I realized that her pain was not a weakness. It was evidence of a life fully experienced, with lessons learned and resilience earned. I began to see emotional struggles not as barriers to love, but as opportunities for deeper connection, understanding, and growth. Witnessing her navigate her challenges inspired me to approach my own difficulties with greater awareness, patience, and compassion. There were moments when I felt a profound sense of gratitude for having her in my life. I appreciated not only her presence, but also the ways she challenged me to grow, reflect, and evolve. She had taught me that relationships are not static. They require effort, mindfulness, and a willingness to adapt. I began to embrace this philosophy, understanding that love is as much about supporting each other's growth as it is about shared joy. Our connection was no longer defined solely by the excitement of newness or the thrill of romance. It was grounded in trust, empathy, and mutual respect, built through countless small, meaningful moments. I also recognized the importance of authenticity in our interactions. She never pretended to be someone she was not, and she encouraged me to do the same. This authenticity created a space where vulnerability could exist without fear, where mistakes could be acknowledged without shame, and where growth was celebrated rather than feared. I came to understand that real intimacy is not about perfection, it is about honesty, empathy, and a willingness to engage deeply with another human being. Her example showed me that vulnerability is a strength, not a liability, and that embracing it allows for richer, more meaningful connections. As our relationship deepened, I began to notice how her pain had shaped her strengths. The experiences that had once caused her hurt now informed her wisdom, empathy, and resilience. She approached life with thoughtfulness and intentionality, valuing depth over superficiality, understanding over assumption, and presence over distraction. Observing this transformation made me reflect on my own experiences, the ways my challenges had shaped me, and the lessons I had learned from past mistakes. It became clear that pain, when processed and understood, can become a source of strength rather than a burden. I also realized that my understanding of love had evolved. Initially, I had approached relationships with a focus on immediacy, seeking connection, reassurance, and affirmation quickly, but being with her taught me that love is patient, observant, and deliberate. It is expressed through empathy, respect, and consistency rather than grand gestures or constant validation. I learned that love is not about possession or control. It is about honoring another person's experiences, respecting their autonomy, and supporting their growth while remaining present and committed. One of the most powerful lessons was learning to balance attention with space. I had once believed that constant engagement was a sign of care, but she taught me that stepping back, allowing her space, and trusting the relationship's natural rhythm was equally important. Giving space did not mean neglect, it meant respecting her individuality and the process by which she navigated her own emotions. This balance between closeness and distance became a cornerstone of our connection, allowing us to maintain intimacy without suffocation, understanding without intrusion, and love without control. Her approach to challenges, both personal and interpersonal, was also instructive. She did not shy away from difficult conversations, nor did she allow emotions to dictate irrational decisions. Instead, she combined reflection, empathy, and honesty to navigate complexity with grace. I learned from her example that challenges are not obstacles to be feared, but opportunities to demonstrate patience, wisdom, and resilience. By observing how she handled adversity, I gained a framework for responding to life's difficulties with composure, compassion, and thoughtfulness. Through all of this, I came to understand that the depth of our bond was rooted not only in affection, but in mutual growth. She had transformed my understanding of human connection, showing me that relationships are a dynamic interplay of empathy, authenticity, patience, and respect. I learned that the most meaningful connections are those in which both parties feel seen, heard, and valued, and in which challenges are navigated collaboratively rather than avoided. This understanding fundamentally changed how I approached every interaction, deepening my capacity for compassion, presence, and meaningful engagement. By the time I reached this point in my reflection, I realized that the lessons I had learned from her absence, from her silences, and from the subtle ways she expressed herself had permanently reshaped how I experienced life and relationships. Every interaction, every word exchanged, Every pause in communication had been a teacher in disguise. I now understood that true empathy is cultivated not through constant engagement, but through mindful observation and heartfelt understanding. Her choice to step back and stop calling me had, paradoxically, been the most profound act of instruction I had ever received. It forced me to confront my own assumptions, my impatience, and my limited understanding of emotional complexity. It was during these quiet moments that I began journaling, not just about my feelings, but about the patterns I had observed in her behavior and my own responses. Writing allowed me to disentangle the emotions that had once felt overwhelming and to trace the growth that had been occurring quietly within me. I documented how her method of expressing care, through gestures, attentiveness, and respect for boundaries, contrasted sharply with my prior ideas of love, which often relied on verbal affirmation and constant reassurance. This reflection helped me internalize the profound truth that relationships are nourished as much by respect and space as they are by connection and communication. I also began discussing my insights with close friends, cautiously at first, unsure if I could articulate the depth of understanding I had gained. Their reactions, often curious and reflective, validated the idea that personal growth can ripple outward, influencing not just oneself, but the way we interact with everyone around us. Sharing these realizations reinforced my commitment to approaching relationships with integrity, patience, and an openness to learning rather than merely seeking gratification or validation. Her absence had created a vacuum, but within that vacuum, I had discovered clarity, self-awareness, and a framework for meaningful human connection. One of the most surprising aspects of this journey was the transformation in my perception of conflict. I had always viewed disagreement as a threat to harmony, something to be avoided or solved quickly. Yet, witnessing her handle challenges with composure, empathy, and deliberate communication taught me that conflict can be an avenue for deeper understanding and growth. Rather than fearing disagreement, I learned to see it as an opportunity to practice active listening, to honor another person's perspective, and to cultivate patience. Over time, this approach not only improved my connection with her, but also enhanced my relationships with family, friends, and colleagues. I realized that the principles she modeled, respect, empathy, and thoughtful engagement, were universally applicable, not limited to romantic contexts. Her absence also clarified the difference between attachment and connection. I had previously conflated constant contact with closeness, assuming that regular communication equaled intimacy. But without the distraction of her calls, I began to understand that real connection is sustained by understanding, trust, and emotional resonance, not by the frequency of interaction. This realization reshaped how I approached not just romantic relationships, but friendships as well. I learned to prioritize quality over quantity, depth over superficiality, and attentiveness over mere availability. It became clear that a meaningful bond is measured by the depth of understanding and mutual respect, rather than by the sheer volume of messages exchanged. Another subtle but powerful lesson involved the notion of personal accountability. When she stopped calling, I was initially tempted to assign blame, to question her motives or my own worth. However, reflection revealed that assigning blame was neither productive nor fair. Instead, I began to focus on my own responses, my own emotional growth, and my ability to engage with empathy rather than defensiveness. This shift in perspective empowered me to take responsibility for my part in the dynamic, to identify areas where I could improve, and to approach relationships with greater intentionality. In doing so, I realized that personal growth is inseparable from relational growth. Improving oneself strengthens the connections we have with others. I also became acutely aware of the power of patience, waiting without complaint, resisting the urge to overanalyze, and allowing her the space to act on her own timeline, taught me a level of patience I had never known. Patience, I discovered, is not passive. It is an active engagement with uncertainty, a trust in process, and a commitment to respect another person's rhythm. Through this lens, her decision to stop calling me was not a punishment or a rejection, but a quiet invitation to grow, to learn, and to cultivate qualities that would make me a better partner, friend, and human being. The lesson was subtle but profound. Patience is a cornerstone of empathy, understanding, and enduring connection. I began to see how her actions had shaped my emotional resilience as well. The initial sting of her absence, the pangs of longing and confusion, gradually softened into a contemplative awareness of life's complexities. I learned to tolerate discomfort without resentment, to navigate ambiguity without panic, and to embrace uncertainty without fear. This newfound resilience extended beyond our relationship, equipping me to handle challenges at work, with friends, and in personal endeavors with greater composure and grace. Her silence had inadvertently taught me to find strength in introspection, courage in patience, and clarity in reflection. Perhaps the most important realization was the depth of gratitude that emerged from this experience. I learned to appreciate not just the moments of joy, but also the moments of struggle, silence, and absence. Gratitude became a lens through which I viewed our relationship, allowing me to recognize the immense value of the lessons embedded in her behavior, even when they were difficult to accept. I understood that every person we encounter has something to teach us, and every experience, pleasant or challenging, is an opportunity for growth. Her decision to stop calling me was not an ending, but a profound beginning, a catalyst for self-discovery, insight, and emotional maturation. In the end, understanding her pain changed the way I understood myself. It illuminated patterns I had ignored, flaws I had overlooked, and strengths I had underutilized. I became more patient, more empathetic, and more intentional in my relationships. I no longer sought to control outcomes or dictate others' actions. Instead, I focused on nurturing understanding, respect, and mutual growth. Love, I realized, is not about constant affirmation or immediate gratification. It is about presence, empathy, patience, and the willingness to learn from both joy and pain. Her absence, paradoxically, became the most instructive presence in my life. And now, reflecting on the journey from confusion and longing to understanding and growth, I feel a sense of completion. I recognize that every moment, every pause, every silence has been a teacher guiding me toward deeper emotional intelligence, authentic connection, and genuine empathy. What once felt like rejection is now a gift. What once seemed like absence is now a space for reflection, insight, and transformation. In learning to understand her pain, I have discovered the true meaning of compassion, patience, and emotional maturity. It is a lesson I carry with me, not just in relationships, but in every aspect of life. A reminder that sometimes the most profound guidance comes not from what is said, but from what is felt, observed, and honored in silence.